Today we're going through rifle scopes. I'm going to show you how I go through the selection process of picking a deer rifle scope for my situation, and I'm also going to show you how to mount it. So stay tuned. Let's get to it. Alright, we got all the stuff in to mount our scope to our new deer rifle. So today we're going to go over scopes and scope rings. Just want to keep in mind that this rifle build is for the woodland deer hunters such as myself. We're taking deer-sized game, whitetail-sized game, whitetail, mule deer, antelope, at less than 300 yards. Very, very rarely would I ever get an opportunity to get something over 200 yards, but we'll say 300 yards and in. And also relatively budget friendly, not cheap, but budget friendly. If you saved up over the year, you should be able to afford something like this. So that being said, let's dive into what I need, what kind of performance criteria I need for a scope. And starting off with the objective, I'm going to be looking for something that's 40 to 50 millimeter, probably closer to the 42, 40, 44 millimeter, and that is because weight becomes a factor. When you start getting big objective lenses, big main tubes, that adds a lot of weight. Remember, this is a deer hunting rifle, not taking it to the bench and shooting matches or anything with that, or just target practice. So that's probably the big one. Once I narrow it down, from there I'm looking for a 3 to 4 power zoom on the low end, preferably 3.5, and that's because, again, I'm taking game in a woodland setting that is 40, 50 yards, probably most of my opportunities, I will say, are between 40 and 80 yards. Do I get some over 100? Absolutely. Have I ever cranked this thing up a lot? Not very often. It's usually set on one of these lower powers all the time. And whether the deer are coming at me or across from me, below me, in close range or long range, I got to be able to pick them up in the scope as they're moving. Hopefully I can get them to stop and take a clean shot. So 3 power on the low end, and then on the high end, I need at least 9 power. And honestly, the 9 power is for the rifle range, sighting it in, being able to zoom in at 100 yards and aim small, miss small, so I get some nice tight groups, so my gun's not lying to me. It's not me yanking the trigger or something. So 9-10 power is adequate, especially even for in a hunting situation. If I ever got that opportunity, which I think I have one time in the last 25 years of hunting, cranking it up to 9 or 10 power to shoot at a deer that luckily stopped for long enough for me to get on them in an open or a clearing over around 200 yards away. So 9 or 10 power will get you there. Good eye relief, that's going to be critical too. Some of these, when you crank them up to 14, 15, 16 power, you're really looking in there trying to find that reticle, because that black box is just bouncing everywhere. You got to be just in the perfect spot. Some good eye relief, especially in deer hunting situation. You're going to be on a lower to medium power. You want to be able just to pull that gun up and boom, your sight picture is right there. So keep that in mind when you're going through all your scopes and looking at them and all your gun pro shops. Well, another thing I want to touch on when looking for a hunting scope is your turrets. A lot of these new scope manufacturers are having exposed turrets on the top and capped on the side, or or exposed on both. Honestly, in my situation, capped turrets are going to be the best, or a locking turret. The main reason is, again, less than 300 yards. Most deer rifles have a max point blank range is going to be around 250, 300 yards. Most of them, not all of them, but most of them. So what that means is if I'm putting the crosshair on the deer, my max point blank range might be an 8-inch circle. No matter where I hold that crosshair, I'm gonna hit in that 8-inch circle out to about 250 yards. So, and again, we're not taking long shots. So when these are set, there's no reason for me to dial these or anything in my situation. So either cap them or lock them. The other reason I don't like the exposed turrets is they sit much taller, first of all, but in my state, we don't need to have our rifles or guns cased in the vehicle. So sliding these in and out of a vehicle or in and out of a gun case, I almost guarantee you these little turrets are going to get bumped, knocked off, and what you thought you had a zero at 100 yards, and you get that one opportunity at 200 or a little bit farther, now you're off. Your gun is off. You thought you had it on, and you can do a holdover, or dial it up or dial it down. You can do a zero stop, or in most hunting situations, it's kind of a split-second decision, and you hold over and you completely miss. And that's because pulling this in and out of your truck, you bump the turret, and now your shot's off. So personally, I prefer capped or locked turrets. Next thing I'm looking for is quality glass, and there are a lot of options when it comes to quality scopes with some good glass, but I'm going to narrow it down to your brand name scopes. I still have some trust issues with the Chinese and Korean knockoffs. I know some of these are made overseas. It is what it is, and we can't keep the price point on them, but they usually go through a more stringent quality control check on the glass. So like your Vortex, Burris, Leupolds, Zeiss, Swarovski, those kind of brands are something I'm going to lean more towards. So glass quality, I do like if there's the better glass quality. It seems to me personally that those low light situations, because whitetails are moving, most of our opportunities are at those last 30 minutes of daylight. And if you're in the woods like I am, you got a large heavy canopy cover. It's 30 minutes before dark, but it seems a little bit darker in the woods. Good glass quality is going to allow you to be able to pull up and see that deer and not really have to hunt for them. So quality glass is another big one. And then, as almost all scope manufacturers today, they do have a fog-proof, waterproof, shock-proof disclaimer on their boxes. They don't. Better make sure they do, because again, hunting situation, snowing, sleeting, raining, foggy mornings, you want to be able to make sure that you can see through your optic and there's no condensation building up inside here. So that's what I'm looking for in my scopes, and I will show you guys which scope I selected here after we go through rings and scope bases. So now when it comes to selecting a rail, I prefer to go with the Picatinny rail. Take a look at this one here. This is I'm not sure which brand it is, but it's a Picatinny, and I believe it takes Weaver as well. I prefer the full length ones. I know they say that, it's hard to get your shells in. Honestly, it's not that bad. The reason I like them is it's one main piece, everything's straight in alignment. I do spend a little more money on these. I prefer the Leupold ones. I think they are excellent quality. I don't know about the cheaper ones, and they're the real cheap ones, I should say, in their quality. I think Leupold sells those for about 45 or 55 bucks. Along with some Weaver rings, if you get some rings that are 60, 70 bucks, I mean, you're at $100 in just mounting your scope. In my opinion, it's worth it because the scope's set on there. It's mounted one time. Probably not taking it off unless you're upgrading your scope, but it's set. It ain't going anywhere. I spend a little bit of money there. If you want, it's a good place to dump an extra 20, 30 bucks. Okay, I want to touch real quick on scope rings and Picatinny rails. So when When it comes to selecting a scope ring for my scope, first of all, make sure you got the correct diameter tube or ring for the diameter tube of scope that you have. So in my case, I have a 1-inch main tube, or 30 millimeters, 34 I believe is the next size up, and it's critical you get the right size scope ring to match that. So when I'm selecting my rings, my criteria is pretty simple. I try to stay away from the super cheap stuff. I know I have some Monstrum ones here. These are relatively inexpensive, but I've had great luck with them. If you can get their, I forget what their top series is called, but it's made out of the same high grade aluminum that the leupold scope base, or leupold Picatinny rails are made out of. I think it's 70-75 aluminum. It's much stiffer than or much stronger than the 60-61, I believe is what a lot of Monstrum stuff is made out of. So of course it wouldn't say on here, but anyway, when I'm selecting my rings, what I prefer are 4 screw holes, going down on top of the scope, and also 2 on the side going in that would mount to your Picatinny rail. The reason I like that is they're generally wider, and they will have 2 slots that will go into your rails. These much cheaper ones, not this guy, that one's specifically for Tikka, but much cheaper ring bases will only have 1 slot, and in this case it's actually the screw. Again, I'm just not real comfortable with that, taking in a ton of force from the recoil of your gun. And in my opinion, if you can have 2 in there, there's just 2 on each scope ring base, there's much less room for error. It can't wiggle too much. So a more sturdy platform in my opinion. And again, these are just all my opinions. You do what you like.
Alright, so for this build, I've selected the Leupold VX3 HD in 3.5 to 10 power by 40 millimeter with a 0 lock elevation adjustment. This is a great little scope, and the reason I went with this over the Freedom series is I found this on super sale for the same price as the Freedom series. Step up in glass quality for the same price. In my opinion, a no-brainer. I'm going to put this on Leupold Backcountry one-piece 20 MOA rail and tie everything together with the Monstrum Pro Series 1-inch low-profile rings. So without further ado, let's jump right into this and get the scope put on that Tikka. Okay, so first tool we're going to need is a 1/16 or the 3/32 punch, and what that's going to be for is popping out those little plugs. I know they look like screws, they got a little slot in them, they look just like a screw, but they're not. We got to punch those through. So we're going to remove the bolt and the magazine, get everything opened up, and push those straight through. Here's a quick peek what they look like. Just make sure that you've got all 4 of them and they're not stuck in your action anywhere. Alright, let's get right down to it with this base. We got the Leupold Backcountry base. We're going to start out by putting a dab, a very, very small dab of blue Loctite on these threads. Put them on all 4 threads. Make sure you got that scope base mounted the correct direction. I usually start by putting the front screw in first, move to the back, and then do the middle 2 after that. Once you've got those screws kind of tightened down by hand, not too tight, we're just going to slide the bolt back in and make sure there's no interference. Those screws should not stick down through into the action, but it never hurts to double check. So we're going to see what Leupold says to mount these bases, what the torque spec is, and we're going to set our torque wrench to the correct setting. And just like we started off with the front screw, we're going to do that again. When we torque it, we're going to go front to back and then the middle 2. Okay, next up is going to be the scope rings. What I like to do is I like to mount the screw heads away from the bolt handle. So if you have these 2 screws like I got, or just a single nut, or some sort of nut driver on the back side, I try to keep it away from the bolt handle. Has it ever interfered? Not in my cases, but that's how I like to do it. I've mounted a few scopes before. I have a general idea of where these are going to line up, but if you haven't done it before, I suggest starting one on each side of the slot, or the opening of your action. Put one in front and one behind, generally right over that first screw head down into the Picatinny rail. We're just going to snug tight those. Again, not torquing them yet, just getting them snug fit into there. We have the rings mounted to the base, snug fit where we think they're going to go. We're going to pop the scope in place and do a test fit on that. What I like to do is crank this thing up to the highest power it will go and set the scope in so it fits right, and I'm going to shoulder it a couple times, and when I put that gun to my shoulder and open my eyes, I should be able to see down that scope, and it should have a clear sight picture. If it's not, you're going to push or pull the scope in or out from your face to try to get that sight picture lined up. So once you get that scope in a good position, I go ahead and I just put a piece of blue tape by that front ring as a reference point, because we're going to pop that scope off and we're going to put it back in. I want to make sure it's in the same spot. So the reason I got to pop it off is we're going to torque those rings down to spec, and for these rings they say to go 25 inch-pounds. That's dry. Since we put some Loctite on there, we're going to go about 20 inch-pounds, 18 to 20 inch-pounds, and torque those down. After that, we're going to get the level out, and we're going to level the gun first, and then I get that tightened down in the vise. That way it doesn't move when I set the scope in. Once we get that set, we're going to put the scope in and level the scope. That way we know the action of the gun is trued up and level. It's snug in place, and the scope is also true and level to that. Now, this is going to take a little bit of time to do. I strongly encourage you to use a vise, whether that's a bench vise or a gun vise, anything to try to hold that gun in place or keep that action level before you get your scope mounted in there, because you are going to be shifting it ever so slightly. You're going to be turning on it and torquing it slightly. You just don't want that thing to budge when you're doing that. Ideally, you want everything to be plumb and square going forward. Once you got the scope leveled with the action, we're going to go ahead and pop those rings back on top. I put the screws in finger tight, maybe slightly tighter than finger tight, and I follow the manufacturer's torque specs or torque pattern when I'm doing that. I'm trying to get the gaps on the rings even on each side when I'm doing this as well. Once those caps are on even, those gaps on each side of the rings are evenly spaced, we're going to go ahead and torque them to spec. I'm going to set my screwdriver torque wrench to 18 inch-pounds in this case, and also I'm going to torque them in the 4-screw configuration torque pattern according to the manufacturer specs. Alright, well that's going to do it for this video. Thanks for checking it out, and hopefully this helps you narrow down your scope selection for your next deer rifle build. And maybe you learned a couple things too when it comes to mounting your scope. Be sure to check out the next video on our Tikka Deer Slayer build, where we discuss barrel channel and free floating. Until then, we'll catch you guys later.